Fall is in the air. The fall of the Roman Empire, that is. A 100 years ago, Frederick C. Howe had a book entitled Confessions of a Monopolist. In it, he said, "This is the story of something for nothing, of making the other fellow pay." Monopolists usually never risk their own capital. They take money from other people and use that to spin it into a fortune, like how Warren Buffett bought a bunch of different insurance companies to use the pooled money of people's premiums to purchase companies for his hedge fund, Berkshire Hathaway.
But that's only part of the reason he became successful. What really allowed him to make astronomical returns was his entry into the insurance business. That might sound like a strange statement. After all, insurance is pretty boring, and you wouldn't expect it to double your money every year. But Warren saw the path to ultimate wealth in exactly this business, which is why in 1967 he started buying up insurance companies, beginning with National Indemnity and culminating with Geico in 1996. Here's why Buffett fell in love with insurance companies. They're essentially like banks. Thousands of people regularly pay their insurance premiums, effectively giving the insurance company a huge cash balance. But people can only withdraw their deposits when something bad happens. For example, when their house burns down or their car breaks. In other words, Buffett was buying companies with $1 billion in cash that was technically considered a liability, and thus wasn't a factor in the purchasing price. Suddenly, he had access to immense capital, which he invested wisely and carefully into A-grade companies.
So basically, what Warren Buffett did was take other people's money from the slush fund of insurance companies that he owned and use that cash to purchase companies like Lego, Fruit of the Loom, Heinz Foods, and so forth. Once he started making a profit on these new acquisitions, he simply returned the principal to the insurance companies and kept the profits for himself. Of course, if the deal had gone south and he lost money, he could just declare that Berkshire Hathaway was too big to fail, and he'd be given bailouts from the government. So any gains that he makes are his, and any losses that he incurs are yours. Why am I mentioning how monopolists get rich using other people's money, making the other fellow pay, as Frederick C. Howe said? Because one new oligarch slush fund method are pension funds that millions of Americans have. Once teachers' unions, policemen's unions, firefighter unions, etc. pool that capital into one giant slush fund, oligarch corporations from BlackRock or Berkshire Hathaway use that money to buy up the planet. The problem with the pension funds is that demographics change. Harry Dent talks about it in his book, The Demographic Cliff. Basically, the entry of the boomers into the economy represented a tidal wave of wealth as they bought new homes to start families, thus driving up the real estate industry. They also invested in 401ks and pension funds for retirement. They created a slush fund for Wall Street, which went on a drunken binge stealing from these pension funds to paper over diminishing productivity. Ellen Schultz writes about this in her book, Retirement Heist. She described how by law, companies were denied access to pension fund money, unless they merged with other companies, hence undergoing what they called a restructuring plan. This was the loophole that allowed them to dip into the funds. This is why we saw an unprecedented number of mergers and acquisitions over the last 30 years. A process of too big to fail happened, as 1 billion companies merged into a handful of powerful behemoths. In summation, the Gilded Age that happened at the turn of the 21st century was funded by these pension funds. The problem? As people age, they retire. Instead of paying into the fund, they draw down on it. The establishment always knew that the economy would hit a brick wall once this began to happen, as the demographics changed, as the boomers started to retire in the 2020s. Financial guru Martin Armstrong made an interesting remark about how when the boomers retire, the oligarchs are planning to replace the missing money with universal basic income.
But I do think we're going into war. I mean, what they really need, what they think they need, I should say, is they need war as the excuse to cover up all the defaults of government debt in Europe. And this is what Schwab has been advising on. All right, they want to create a new Bretton Woods, and the new currency will be all digital. So they'll just cancel all, Europe is used to that. They just cancel all the paper currency.
America, that means they cancel all the pensions.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you're talking about with their guaranteed basic income, is to replace the pensions.
What he's calling guaranteed basic income is what's more properly called universal basic income, and it's what's slated to happen after people realize that the pension funds have been raided and are worthless. England just found out about this about a week ago when their pension fund had a crisis and the Bank of England had to infuse £1.5 trillion into the system to keep it from defaulting.
Now, before we get truly into it, let's just remind ourselves of Exeter's pyramid, because this is essentially what was happening this week. We've got Exeter's pyramid, which is a debt pyramid. We essentially live in a giant Ponzi scheme. There's all of this debt and there's not enough money to repay that debt. Now, that's fine so long as you can keep printing debt and keep growing the economy. But the problem is we are no longer growing the economy. We are entering a global recession. There is too much debt and not enough money to repay the debt. And the problem there is the only way that you can stop this Ponzi scheme from collapsing is to keep putting more money into it, keep putting more credit into it. The problem is if you've reached your limits of growth, then what happens? Then you have a debt collapse. You have people go bankrupt. And because of the interconnectedness of the financial system, there are all these counterparties. And if one person defaults, that leads to somebody else defaulting, and on and on and on it goes until eventually the whole system cascades down into a debt collapse. Now, this week, what happened in the UK was that trigger. It was one of those triggers to bring down the whole system. So take a look at Exeter's pyramid on the screen. You can see we've got all these different layers. And where the crisis began to unfold this week was on the very top layer, which was derivatives, and on the third layer, which was banks and pension funds, which are on the third layer. So what actually started to happen this week was the pension funds got some margin calls on a portion of their portfolios. Now, these pension funds hold the pensions of millions and millions of UK citizens. Now, I've been saying for a long time, those pensions are going to die. They are worthless already. The only thing you can do to save yourself is to get that money out now. Otherwise, if you leave it in there, they're going to zero. And that is what was going to happen this week. Believe it or not, what I've predicted was about to happen. And the way it happened was the pension funds are exposed to these things called derivatives. Now, I'm going to explain that more in today's show, so I won't go into it now. But essentially what was happening was this top layer and the third layer was starting to come collapsing down. It was going to bring down with it investment banks, then that would have brought down with it the commercial banking sector, and it was all going to come collapsing down. But what happened was we got to the government bonds level, which is where the government can step in and the central bank can step in, and that's exactly what they did. And they came in and they pumped money back up into the system. They pumped money in there in a certain way with quantitative easing. It's not quite money printing, it's purchasing government bonds. But the central bank came in and bought lots of government bonds and pushed that back into the system and essentially managed to avert the top layers from coming collapsing down. And that's exactly what was going to happen. But there are huge consequences to this. You can see if you go up 3 from the bottom, land, commodities, and then there's this level called paper currencies. And I put on my Exeter's pyramid that I created hyperinflation to backstop the system. And that is the stage that we have now arrived at. We are at the stage of backstopping the system by printing lots of money and doing unlimited quantitative easing.
Note how he said that we live in a big Ponzi scheme. And Ponzi schemes require that money keep being pumped into them. Once the money stops, the pyramid collapses. The World Economic Forum's scheme for keeping endless printing is universal basic income. Basically, welfare to everyone. They'll be paid out in central bank digital currency. The problem with that? They've been beta testing this in China. They're going to have UBI hooked up to social credit systems. If you step out of line, they'll be able to shut off your money. You'll starve effectively. But almost as troubling as that is the fact that the money that you have will just basically disappear. It has an expiration date. The Economic Times reported on this in their article. Digital currency, yuan comes with an expiry date. Spend it or it will vanish. Imagine living in a world where you can't save a single dollar. Any surplus that you save up will be deleted at the end of the month, so you'll be kept permanently dependent on the system in a giant hamster wheel. Perhaps this is what the World Economic Forum euphemistically refers to as their touted circular economy. Annalisa Pesek makes reference to this in the New American's upcoming bookazine, where she writes, "Look no further than a 2016 video that emerged from the WEF titled 8 Predictions for the World in 2030. Compiled with input from WEF agenda contributors and members of the group's Global Future Councils, the clip's insidious message spreading far and wide ignited backlash for its bold declarations of a utopian future in which no one owns anything but borrows what one needs upon demand from the apparently endless giving government." Note the term borrow. The way that they see money is not that you work for it and own it, but that you're merely leasing it. They can shut it off at any point, which means it's never really yours. And not only will you be expected to lease your money, you'll also be expected to lease other things, as this person from the World Economic Forum explains.
And the third thing I will point to is a very big move that's happening at the moment from product to service. I have a friend, he says, every product is a service waiting to happen. If you think about it, I mean, your cell phone, why do you want to own your cell phone? How many of you own your cell phones? How many knows if the company owns it? It's actually not a lot. I mean, you want the function, you want the service, right? Why do you want to own a cell phone if you can just lease it? And if you lease, why shouldn't you lease your refrigerator or your washing machine or your dishwasher, or why do you want to own it?
As they said, by 2030, you will own nothing and be happy. As for the second part of that phrase, take that with a huge grain of salt. In closing, just be conscious that UBI isn't about making you happy. It's about creating a permanent injection of digital currency into a Ponzi scheme that requires it to stave off collapse. Because if that collapse happens, the oligarchs will lose power. If, however, you can be induced to become a serf and to accept permanent injections of imaginary money, then the system will be able to hobble on for a little bit longer. You can read more about these issues and see Annalisa Pesic's article in the new bookazine, The Great Reset and Transhumanism, which will be out later this month. If you can't wait that long, check out Dennis Barron's book, Endgame, where he lays out a brilliant overview of what's going on. You can buy it at Amazon.com or at any fine retailer. Endgame. Give it a read.